This is a broadcast from October 26, 1963.
Good evening, friends. This is your narrator speaking to you from Studio B, where the amber glow of vacuum tubes casts long shadows across worn wooden floors, and the scent of cigarette smoke mingles with the electrical hum of broadcasting equipment. Tonight, I bring you a tale that began in the winter of 1943, when the world was at war, and the airwaves carried more than just music and news. It was a story that would haunt the corridors of radio stations for years to come. A mystery that began with nothing more than static, yet would challenge everything we thought we knew about the invisible signals that connect us all. Picture, if you will, station WKRP in Chicago. Not the gleaming towers of today's broadcasting empires, but a modest operation housed in the third floor of the Meridian building on State Street. The windows rattled when the L train passed, and the radiators clanged through the long winter nights. It was here that our story begins, on a Tuesday evening in February, when the temperature had dropped to 12 below zero, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut through the city like a blade. Tommy Garrison was pulling the overnight shift. At 26, he was still young enough to believe that radio could change the world, yet old enough to know that most nights it simply helped lonely souls feel less alone in the darkness. His fingers moved across the control board with practiced precision, adjusting levels, cueing records, monitoring the transmitter readings that glowed softly in the dim booth. The station manager had gone home hours ago. The building was empty, except for Tommy and Mrs. Henderson, the cleaning lady who worked her way through the offices with methodical determination. Outside, Chicago slept under a blanket of fresh snow, while inside, Tommy spun records and read advertisements for soap and cigarettes to anyone still awake at 2 in the morning. It was during a commercial break, while Tommy was organizing the next hour's programming, that he first heard it, a whisper beneath the static. So faint, so brief, that he almost convinced himself it was nothing more than atmospheric interference. After all, winter weather played tricks with radio signals. Everyone in the business knew that. But as the night wore on, the whisper grew stronger. At first, it seemed like nothing more than random noise, the kind of interference that plagued AM radio during storms or solar activity. Tommy adjusted the antenna array, checked the transmitter settings, even tapped the microphone to ensure his own signal was clear. Yet beneath it all, threading through the familiar hiss and pop of the airwaves, something else was trying to break through. By 3:30 in the morning, Tommy could make out patterns in the static. Not words, exactly, but rhythms, pauses. The unmistakable cadence of human speech, though distorted beyond recognition. He leaned closer to the monitors, his coffee growing cold as he strained to understand what he was hearing. The sound seemed to pulse with its own life, rising and falling like breathing, like a heartbeat transmitted through miles of copper wire in electromagnetic waves. Tommy found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the slightest sound might cause this mysterious signal to disappear back into the electronic ether from which it had emerged. Now, friends, let me paint you a picture of what radio meant in those days. This was before television had conquered American living rooms, before families gathered around glowing screens instead of wooden cabinets filled with glowing tubes. Radio was magic then, voices traveling hundreds of miles through the air, carrying news from distant battlefields, music from grand ballrooms, and stories that sparked the imagination in ways that no other medium could match. Every household had at least one radio, often more. They were the centerpiece of family life, drawing people together each evening to share in the great collective experience of broadcasting. Children would huddle close to hear adventure serials, while parents stayed informed about the war effort and the struggles of their boys overseas. But radio was also intimate in a way that's hard to imagine today. When you spoke into a microphone, you weren't addressing a crowd. You were talking to individuals, alone in their kitchens, their bedrooms, their automobiles. You were a voice in the darkness, a companion for the sleepless, a thread connecting millions of separate lives into something resembling a community. Tommy understood this responsibility. He took pride in his work, even if it meant staying awake through the long hours when most of the world slept. He knew that somewhere out there, factory workers heading to early shifts might be listening, night nurses making their rounds, insomniacs pacing their apartments. His voice was their lifeline to the larger world, their reminder that they weren't truly alone. Which is why the mysterious signal troubled him so deeply. Someone, somewhere was trying to communicate, and Tommy was perhaps the only person in Chicago who could hear them. As dawn approached, the signal began to fade. Not gradually, as atmospheric conditions might explain, but abruptly, as if someone had simply switched off a transmitter. Tommy made careful notes in the station log, documenting the time, frequency, and characteristics of what he had heard. He considered calling the station manager, but what would he say? That he'd heard voices in the static? That someone was broadcasting on an unauthorized frequency? The Federal Communications Commission took such violations seriously, especially during wartime. Unlicensed transmissions could be anything from amateur radio operators to enemy agents. But Tommy's instincts told him this was something different entirely. The signal had felt lost, desperate, not threatening but pleading. When the day shift arrived at 6 a.m., Tommy briefed his replacement and gathered his notes. The February sun was just beginning to paint the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold, and State Street was coming alive with the sounds of early morning traffic. Tommy walked to the L station, his mind still focused on what he had heard, wondering if he would encounter the signal again the next night. He didn't have to wait that long. The first call came to the station switchboard at 11 a.m. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman from the South Side wanted to know if anyone else had heard the voices during the overnight broadcast. Then came a call from Mr. Frank Kowalski, a factory foreman who had been listening while working the graveyard shift at the steel mill. He described the same phenomena, voices beneath the static, words just beyond comprehension, a sense that someone was trying to communicate across an impossible distance. By afternoon, the switchboard was overwhelmed. Listeners from across Chicago and the surrounding areas were calling to report similar experiences. They had all heard something unusual during the early morning hours, something that seemed to be transmitted on WKRP's frequency, yet clearly wasn't part of the station's regular programming. Tommy returned to work that evening with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The station manager, Harold Morrison, had decided to monitor the overnight broadcast personally, curious about the reports that had flooded in throughout the day. Together, they prepared for another long night, equipped with recording equipment and notebooks, determined to document whatever they might encounter. The signal returned at exactly 2:47 a.m. This time, it was stronger, clearer, more focused. And for the first time, Tommy and Harold could make out actual words, though they seemed to come from impossibly far away, filtered through layers of static and interference that suggested vast distances and unknown technologies. The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking with the precise diction of a professional broadcaster. But there was something wrong with the transmission. Temporal echoes, as if the words were being repeated across multiple timelines, bouncing between past and future before finally reaching their microphones. "This is station WXYZ, broadcasting from..." The signal faded, then strengthened. "The year 1963. Can anyone hear us? We've been trying to reach, trying to warn." Harold gripped Tommy's shoulder, both men leaning closer to the speakers. The implications were staggering. A radio signal from 20 years in the future? It was impossible, absurd, yet undeniably real. The voice continued, growing more urgent. "The technology exists. Temporal radio transmission. But something went wrong, caught between frequencies, between years. If anyone can hear this, please respond on..." Static overwhelmed the signal, reducing it to incomprehensible noise. Tommy frantically adjusted the controls, trying to maintain the connection, but the voice was gone, leaving only the familiar hiss of empty airwaves. Harold stood slowly, his face pale in the amber light of the control room. A practical man who had worked in radio for 15 years, he was struggling to reconcile what he had heard with everything he knew about broadcasting technology. Temporal transmission was the stuff of science fiction, yet the evidence was recorded on their equipment, witnessed by two trained professionals who understood the technical impossibilities they had just experienced. "We document everything," Harold said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every transmission, every detail. And we tell no one outside this room until we understand what we're dealing with." Over the following weeks, the pattern became clear. The mysterious signal appeared regularly between 2:30 and 4 a.m., always on WKRP's frequency, always featuring the same voice claiming to broadcast from station WXYZ in 1963. But the messages were fragmentary, interrupted by static storms that seemed to exist outside normal atmospheric conditions. Gradually, a story emerged from these scattered transmissions. The broadcaster, who identified himself only as Richard, was part of an experimental program to develop temporal radio communication. The technology had been successful beyond their wildest expectations, allowing them to send signals across decades rather than miles. But something had gone wrong during a test transmission, trapping Richard's signal in a temporal loop that carried his voice backward through time to WKRP in 1943. The implications were profound. Richard claimed to be broadcasting from a world 20 years in the future, a world shaped by technologies and events that hadn't yet occurred in Tommy's time. He spoke of television as commonplace, of satellites orbiting the Earth, of conflicts and discoveries that belonged to an unimaginable tomorrow. But more disturbing were his warnings about the present. Richard claimed to have access to historical records, and he was trying to alert people in 1943 about events that were yet to unfold. Military strategies that would fail, diplomatic initiatives that would collapse, personal tragedies that might be prevented if the right people could be warned in time. Tommy found himself staying after his shifts, poring over transcripts of the transmissions, trying to decode the temporal puzzle that had fallen into his lap. The signals were becoming clearer, more frequent, as if the connection between 1943 and 1963 was strengthening with each passing night. Harold had contacted a physicist at the University of Chicago, Dr. Margaret Chen, who specialized in electromagnetic theory. Without revealing the true nature of their discovery, he asked her about the theoretical possibilities of radio signals traveling through time. Her response was both encouraging and terrifying. While temporal transmission was theoretically impossible with current technology, certain quantum mechanical effects might allow information to be transmitted across temporal boundaries under extremely specific conditions. The conditions she described matched exactly what Richard had claimed about his experimental setup. Now, friends, imagine the weight of such knowledge. Tommy and Harold found themselves in possession of information that could change the course of history itself. They had access to a voice from the future, carrying warnings and insights that could save lives, prevent disasters, alter the very fabric of the world they knew. But with that knowledge came impossible choices. Should they alert the authorities, risking that the temporal connection might be destroyed by government interference? Should they act on Richard's warnings, potentially creating paradoxes that might unravel the timeline itself? Or should they remain silent, allowing events to unfold, as Richard's history suggested they already had? The ethical implications were staggering. If Richard's warnings were accurate, they had the power to save thousands of lives. But they also risked destroying the very future from which those warnings came. Every action they took, every decision they made, might ripple forward through time to create a world that Richard would no longer recognize. As February turned to March, the transmissions began to change. Richard's voice carried new urgency, new desperation. He claimed that his temporal experiments were destabilizing, that his connection to 1943 was becoming dangerous to both timelines. The static storms grew more violent, accompanied by electrical disturbances that affected equipment throughout the Meridian building. Tommy began experiencing strange phenomena during the broadcasts. Clocks would run backward for brief moments. Shadows would move independently of their sources. He would hear fragments of conversations that hadn't yet occurred, see glimpses of faces belonging to people he wouldn't meet for years. The boundary between past and future was wearing thin, and Tommy found himself caught in the middle of forces beyond human comprehension. The crisis came on the night of March 15th. Tommy was alone in the station, Harold having gone home early with a fever that had been plaguing him for days. The transmission began as usual, but Richard's voice was different, panicked, urgent, barely coherent. "The containment field is failing," Richard's voice crackled through the static. "The temporal distortion is expanding, affecting multiple timelines. We have to shut down the experiment before." The signal exploded into chaos. Every piece of equipment in the control room began malfunctioning simultaneously. Lights flickered in patterns that hurt to look at. The very air seemed to shimmer with temporal distortions that made Tommy's vision blur and his mind reel. Through it all, Richard's voice continued, growing fainter as the connection destabilized. "Tommy, if you can hear me, the frequency modulation controls. Set them to precisely 1240.7. It should collapse the temporal bridge safely." Tommy fought his way through the electromagnetic storm that had erupted around him, reaching for the frequency controls with hands that seemed to be aging and growing young again in rapid cycles. The numbers on the dials were shifting, changing, as if time itself couldn't decide what they should read. "Hurry!" Richard's voice was barely audible now. "The cascade effect. It's spreading, multiple timelines converging. 1240.7. Exactly." Tommy's fingers found the frequency dial, turning it with desperate precision. The number 1240.7 appeared briefly among the shifting digits, and he locked the setting just as the temporal storm reached its peak. The silence that followed was more absolute than anything Tommy had ever experienced. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of possibility itself, as if the universe had held its breath while reality reorganized itself around new parameters. When the normal sounds of the night gradually returned, the hum of equipment, the distant rumble of traffic, the whisper of wind through the building, Tommy found himself alone in a control room that looked exactly as it had hours earlier, yet somehow felt fundamentally different. Richard's voice was gone. The mysterious signal had vanished completely, leaving no trace of its existence except for Tommy's memories and the detailed logs he had maintained over the past month. But had it really happened at all? Tommy spent the following days reviewing his notes, listening to the recordings, trying to convince himself that the temporal transmissions had been real. The evidence seemed solid, until he played the recordings for Harold, who looked at him with genuine concern and suggested that perhaps the isolation of the overnight shift was taking its toll. The recordings contained nothing but normal static. The detailed logs, written in Tommy's own handwriting, described routine atmospheric interference. The careful documentation of Richard's warnings and futuristic descriptions read like the fantasies of an overworked imagination. Dr. Chen, when contacted again, confirmed that temporal radio transmission remained theoretically impossible. The specific quantum conditions she had described existed only in theoretical mathematics, not in any technology that could be constructed with 1943-era equipment. Tommy found himself questioning his own sanity. Had the long nights of solitude, the stress of wartime broadcasting, the weight of responsibility finally caused his mind to create an elaborate fiction? Were the temporal transmissions nothing more than auditory hallucinations, given structure and meaning by his desperate need to believe in something larger than his small role in the vast machinery of radio broadcasting? Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been lost when he adjusted those frequency controls. Something that might have changed everything, if only he had been brave enough to let it continue. Spring arrived in Chicago with its usual mixture of hope and uncertainty. The war continued to rage across the globe, following patterns that seemed frustratingly familiar to Tommy, as if he had somehow known what would happen before it occurred. Small details would surface in his memory moments before they were reported in the news. Casualty figures, strategic decisions, political developments that felt like echoes of warnings he might have heard in another lifetime. Tommy continued working the overnight shift, spinning records and reading advertisements to the sleepless citizens of Chicago. But he found himself listening more carefully to the static between stations, hoping for some sign that the temporal bridge might reestablish itself, that Richard's voice might return with its messages from the impossible future of 1963. The signal never returned, yet Tommy continued to monitor the frequencies, continued to document atmospheric anomalies, continued to believe that somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, voices from other times were still trying to reach across the void that separated past from future. Years passed. The war ended. Television began its inexorable rise to dominance. Radio evolved, adapted, survived, but never again held the central place in American life that it had occupied during those crucial years of the 1940s. Tommy remained at WKRP, eventually becoming station manager himself when Harold retired in 1952. He hired young broadcasters who reminded him of himself in 1943, idealistic, dedicated, convinced that radio could make a difference in the world. He never told them about the temporal transmissions, but he encouraged them to listen carefully to the static, to remain open to the possibility that the airwaves might carry more than just conventional signals. In 1963, 20 years after the mysterious broadcast had ended, Tommy paid special attention to the radio industry, watching for any sign of temporal transmission experiments, any indication that Richard and his colleagues might finally be conducting the research that had somehow reached backward through time. He found nothing. No station WXYZ, no experimental temporal communication programs, no broadcaster named Richard who fit the voice he remembered from those strange nights in 1943. Yet Tommy never doubted what he had experienced. The memories remained vivid, detailed, consistent with everything he knew about radio technology and electromagnetic theory. The warnings Richard had transmitted continued to echo in his mind, and he began to recognize their accuracy as historical events unfolded exactly as the future broadcaster had predicted. The Korean War developed along lines that Richard had described. Political figures rose and fell according to patterns that matched the temporal transmissions. Technological developments emerged precisely when Richard had said they would, as if the future was following a script that Tommy had been privileged to hear in advance. But if Richard's timeline was accurate, then the temporal experiments that created the transmissions should have occurred in 1963. The fact that they didn't suggested one of several possibilities. Either Tommy had imagined the entire experience, or his actions on March 15, 1943, had somehow prevented the future that Richard represented from ever coming to pass. The implications of this possibility haunted Tommy for the rest of his career. If he had indeed changed history by collapsing the temporal bridge, then Richard's timeline, with all its warnings and insights, had been erased, replaced by a different future that might be better or worse than the one the temporal broadcaster had described. Tommy found himself watching the world with the eyes of someone who had glimpsed an alternative reality, comparing what actually happened with what Richard had claimed would happen. The differences were subtle but significant. Conflicts that Richard had predicted never materialized, while other crises emerged that the future broadcaster had never mentioned. By the time Tommy retired from WKRP in 1968, 25 years after the temporal transmissions had ended, he had become convinced that his actions had indeed altered the course of history. The future of 1963 that Richard represented had been replaced by a different timeline, one shaped by the absence of temporal communication rather than its presence. Whether this change had been beneficial remained an open question. The world of 1968 had its own problems, its own conflicts, its own uncertainties about the future. But it was a world that had developed naturally, without the intervention of voices from tomorrow warning about events that hadn't yet occurred. Tommy kept his detailed logs from 1943, storing them in a safety deposit box along with instructions that they should be opened only if similar temporal phenomena were ever reported by other radio operators. He never spoke publicly about his experience, but he continued to monitor scientific developments in temporal physics, hoping that someday the technology Richard had described might emerge from the realm of theory into practical application. That day never came during Tommy's lifetime. Now, as I conclude this tale, I want you to consider what it means to be a voice in the darkness, reaching across impossible distances to touch the lives of strangers. Radio taught us that connection was possible even when physical presence was not, that words could travel farther than the people who spoke them, that the electromagnetic spectrum might carry more than just information. It might carry hope, comfort, warning, and wonder. Tommy Garrison's story reminds us that the boundaries of reality are more fluid than we often assume. Time, space, causality itself, all might be more malleable than our everyday experience suggests. The radio waves that surround us constantly, carrying voices and music and data through the invisible medium of the atmosphere, might occasionally carry something more. Echoes from other times, messages from alternative realities, warnings from futures that might never come to pass. In our modern world of satellites and fiber optic cables, of digital transmission and global connectivity, it's easy to forget the magic that once surrounded radio broadcasting. But that magic hasn't disappeared. It has simply become more subtle, more hidden beneath layers of technology and commerce and routine. Listen carefully to the static between stations sometime. Pay attention to the moments when signals fade in and out of comprehension. Be open to the possibility that the electromagnetic spectrum might still carry messages from times and places beyond our normal understanding. Because somewhere out there, in the vast web of radio waves that binds our world together, other voices might be calling. Other timelines might be reaching across the void, trying to warn us, guide us, or simply remind us that we are not alone in the great cosmic dance of existence. Tommy Garrison heard such a voice in 1943, and his decision to answer it, or to silence it, may have changed the course of history itself. But his story also suggests that we all have the power to listen, to respond, to make choices that ripple across time in ways we can barely imagine. The next time you hear static on your radio, remember Tommy's story. Remember that the airwaves carry more than just entertainment and information. They carry possibility itself, transmitted through the darkness from sources we cannot see to destinations we cannot predict. And in that transmission, in that connection across impossible distances, we find something that transcends the limitations of our individual lives. The knowledge that voices can reach across any void, that messages can travel through any medium, and that even in the darkest hours of the night, we are never truly alone. The signal continues, friends. It always has, and it always will. We need only the courage to listen, and the wisdom to know when we hear something that demands a response. This has been your narrator, signing off from Studio B, where the amber glow of vacuum tubes still casts long shadows, and the whisper of distant voices continues to drift through the electromagnetic night. Until we meet again in the frequency of imagination, keep listening to the signals between the static. You never know what messages might be waiting there, calling across time itself to reach your eager ears. Good night and good listening.